out today. He's be going to have a checkup. For the good news for the people in the here, we will not meet tomorrow, okay? But we will work to 2302 Monday, so we're going to need you all hands on deck. Today we're going to go back and hear one person in 2302. Then we officially close that hearing, and then I'd like to work to bill 2279. So that's kind of the plan that we have. Okay? Any particular questions or whatever? All right. Well, again, welcome, and Speaker May, we're glad to have you to our committee. And I know being a speaker, it's hard to keep it short, but we're glad to have you here, and good luck.
Mr. Chairman, I always do with the Senator. It is good to be here today, and I do enjoy doing this. I don't do it much anymore. I am retired. The only reason I'm here is because the Rural Water Association is a group I've been affiliated in one way or another since I was about 19 years old, and that's a few years ago. And I have such admiration for them, and they are not really schooled in the legislative way, so I show up here. I think I'm a little bit like an old pickup. Every now and then you want to start it up and drive it around a little bit and make sure it hasn't fallen apart. That's me. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, maybe I should say Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, I am representing the Kansas Rural Water Association. It is an association that made up of 265 rural districts, and there are 475 municipalities that also have joined it because of their expertise in the area of rural water. The Rural Water Association very much supports 2020 or 2302. We see it as a really well-written, comprehensive bill that it will make changes that, if it will remain in place over the years, will have an effect, a wonderful effect on Kansas in the future. We need to address this. Very quickly, I know you told me to be quick, and I've just got two more things. I do want to tell you that when I was 25 years old, I decided I wanted to run for the legislature. And we had a senior member of the legislature that lived not too far from me, and he was in a different district. I went to him and told him what I had in mind. He said, you know, you might want to go down the legislature and kind of watch what's going on, see if that's something you would like. So I did. I went down, and lo and behold, the day that I showed up to watch general orders was the day that they were working the water bill. That was 1976. And I doubt if anyone here knows him, but state rep was Sandy Duncan that carried the bill. And this was a 3-hour debate. There were people that were for it, there were people that were against it, people that were suspicious, people that wanted to change it. Where's the water going, the money going to go, and are you going to rob this for that and everything? It passed. It passed both houses, and the governor signed it. And everybody thought it was okay. But as we all know, it went away over the years until there's not much left now. And here we are in a time when we need to address this more than anything. So I feel that based on what I've talked to people here and what I saw over in the House, that this bill will pass. Both houses will be signed by the governor, but that's just the beginning. You have to keep it there. It has to not be rated, and that is, there's a lot of temptation future legislatures to do just that, particularly with the kind of turnover we have in the House. The Rural Water Association, as I said, supports this. We do have one suggestion for a small, but I think good amendment. There is a town that is indicative of a lot of small towns in Kansas. Clayton, Kansas is about 30 miles northeast of Colby. And Clayton has a population of 54 people. The average age is 65 and a half. A few years ago, Clayton was presented with a problem. There was arsenic in the source water. And so the KDHE told them that they had to buy an arsenic removing machine. Those things go at a minimum of $100,000 or more. So the loan came out of the same loan that we have today. And they have not been able to make their payments. And it's a sad, sad situation. And what's really sad is that they're the poster child of this. All over Kansas, there are other water systems and municipalities that have the same problem. The problem is that during the period of time that they obtained their loan, they went with the USDA. There is no forgiveness right now for the USDA loans. And we would like to insert in new section 3C, and I'll give some language to the revisers if they want it, that will, it's very simple, that loan balances payable to the United States of America, USD, rural, excuse me, I didn't bring my bifocals, rural development for public water supply and wastewater systems projects or improvements. Simple, and it will have a profound effect on a number of small cities and their people. They have no other way. This bill, as it stands now, will not help them at all without this amendment. So that is my main reason I'm here, is to urge you to do something for Clayton and the other Claytons of this city, of this state. I will stand for questions if you have any.
Thank you very much. And as we work this bill Monday, we will take this consideration. Okay. Does anyone have any particular question for our speaker? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug, is there other Claytons out there that you're aware of right now?
Yes. There are a number of needy cities around the state that their timing was bad, and they need relief. Not many, but there are a few. I mean, once this is done and it's eliminated, there will be no new Claytons. They'll all come under this bill.
Can I follow up, please?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
So approximately how much money are we talking for each Clayton that's out there?
Hard to say. I would say probably, this is purely, I'm pulling numbers out of the air, somewhere between 25 and 150,000. You know, of course, I looked through and I saw figures like 8 million in there, and I thought, wow, but no. I think it's doable, and I think it's something that we really need to do. You know, I lived in a small town, and I know how something like this can really, really affect things. They could not possibly raise taxes enough to pay for it.
Thank you. I'm sure that we could do some research and find out what other towns or cities in the position and then how much money it is before we get to that. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and bringing this information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Okay. If not any other question, I will close the hearing on 2302. And we'll switch gears and we'll go to see if we would like to work the bill on HB 2279, and we'll see what the committee what's the pleasure of the committee. You're pointing? Yes. Would the reviser read the bill explain the bill to us, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2279, as amended by House Committee, would require groundwater management districts to submit annual reports to the legislature and develop priority areas of concern and action plans and submit those to the chief engineer. Specifically, the bill would require the board of each GMD to submit annual written reports to the legislature on the finances and activities of the district on or before January 31st of each year. Additionally, the bill would require the GMD boards to identify priority areas of concern within a district and set reasonable boundaries using data from the Kansas Geological Survey or other source approved by the chief engineer, and that would be on or before January 1 of 2024. Additionally, the GMDs would be required to conduct public education and outreach in each priority area and develop an action plan. The GMD board would be required to review the priority areas of concern and any action plan previously adopted in the district every 5 years. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. This is a bill that the House has worked on it for a few years, okay? Yes, question.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Tamara, the current situation is the GMDs are not prohibited from working with the Division of Water Resources and the Department of Agriculture, correct?
I am not aware of any prohibition, no.
Thank you. And I believe that they do currently work with the Division of Water Resources and the Department of Agriculture, just not on a mandated basis. They work with them as needed that fits their unique situations. Thank you.
Mr. Peck, Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Several places in the legislation, we see a reference to the chief engineer. There's language required by the chief engineer, approved by the chief engineer, approved by the chief engineers, and there are multiple times. Who is this chief engineer? I don't mean by name, but are they in the water? Is it the chief engineer chosen by the director of the water? Or can you help me out with who that is? And it mentions it even in the title.
It is a statutorily created position. It is in the Department of Agriculture. And I believe the chief engineer is selected by the Secretary of Agriculture.
So the Secretary of Agriculture chooses a chief engineer, and that's who's referenced throughout this bill when water divisions and facilities and districts have to get approval. It's all on this one person's shoulders.
Yes.
Okay. And I have another question, Mr. Vice Chairman. And this is for the reviser. This is in Section 2A, stricken language. Why is that language stricken? Is it somewhere else in the legislation? Because it says, it starts off, it is the intent of the legislature that the groundwater resources, et cetera. Well, I don't know that we need to remove, unless it's somewhere else, the intent of the legislature.
Yeah, so that language that is stricken was in the original bill. It is not in current statute, and that was an amendment made by the House committee, and I can't speak to the reasoning why the House made that choice.
Okay, so that the stricken was a House amendment.
Correct.
And you do not know why, you or research know why the House struck it?
I was not present for the House's debate on it, so I can't speak to it, no.
Mr.
Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kenny Titus, State Representative. So the House struck that language. It was in the original bill, but some of the provisions were pared back. So that language was actually copied. If the very first statute, 82A-1020, actually contains that exact language, and it's the intent of the entire GMD Act. And as some provisions were changed around that in the bill, that it just seemed like extra language that wasn't needed, and so we went ahead and removed it at this part of the bill. But it's still subject to that part of the GMD Act.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Okay, that was my concern, that it is still in statute somewhere, so it's not changing anything, because I believe it's very important, Mr. Vice Chairman, that we sometimes be specific that the intent of the legislature, because there's a lot of times the intent of the legislature is not followed, particularly by judiciary, and some government bureaucracies. But Representative, I appreciate you stepping up and answering that question for us. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you. Any others? Oh, yes, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have a question, but I do have an amendment. Would it be appropriate to introduce that at this time? And
Just a minute. Does anyone else have any other questions? If not, we'll go to the amendment. Yes, go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm asking to do this because I have pages this morning. So I very much appreciate the help from the reviser and the comments that were made during the testimony. Oh, wow, yeah. Mr. Chair, I realize that this is a fairly detailed or long amendment, and I'm hoping that we could take it in chunks. And the first chunk would be what appears on the first, pretty much on the first page. And this deals with the comments from the groundwater districts about having to have a report on the finances that was audited, and then another report that was their current information, and then also looking at the report that's, the information on the report that is on page 4 that was going to be added January of 2025. So what this amendment does, and I think it's up to the legislature to pick the date that we ask the report to be filed, but I was suggesting no later than January 25th, and I did bring our session planner to give us an idea of what that would mean in terms of getting that information before we want to work on it. I'm also thinking that it would be helpful not just to have the audits of what the groundwater districts have done, but a budget. So we're looking towards the future. So they would have already established their budgets for the current year at that time, and we could look at that. And the groundwater districts that I talked to were also comfortable with that. So we're looking at the report and the budget. I'm trying to condense the language so that we say the annual report shall include but not be limited to the most recent audit and prepared according to our statutes, an accounting of all assets, the budget adopted for the current year, and then the detailed statement that explains how the expenditures by the board serve to further those needs. And then it also adds the beginning in January 2025, the report shall summarize the action plans and activities undertaken pursuant to Section 2. So are there any questions about that?
I have one. I talked to some of the, and they would like to change that first date to February 28, just to give more time. I understand it's from last year, but give them a little more time to put it in there. I'd like to have a discussion on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that there was interest in having that date moved back when they thought that we were asking for the current audit or the audit for the previous calendar year, because they often don't have that audit approved. So this proposal is simply asking for the most recent approved audit. So they would have that information at that time.
When do they get the audit? Do you know the date of that?
I think when March, it could be as late as March, to get the approval or have that audit be presented to the board. So I'm saying they'd have it in March, and then we're seeing it the following year. So this is something that I think they very easily have on hand.
Okay, does anyone else have, Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is this is quite extensive of an amendment. And I'm not sure we all have time to grasp all what this amendment's going to do. I mean, seems fairly simple now, but I don't feel real comfortable with all the changes that are, I mean, throughout this whole thing, it's changed. It makes me quite nervous to make a vote on it today until I've had the opportunity to indulge in this thing a lot more than, that's just my thought.
I understand. When I saw this yesterday, I turned white myself. I went ahead and I looked at it, and most of the changes are dates, or if the idea is it's kind of, have a budget and it's kind of looking, have them looking forward. Well, let's just go through it, and then we could wait till Monday on this and see if you feel comfortable on it. But I understand where you're coming from, Senator. No, I'm fine. Okay, any other comments? Senator Strzok.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was about to say the same thing. I do have a question. Are the GMDs currently required to audit every year? And who does that audit? Is it an outside entity, or is it DWR? Who is it? And what's the current practice on that?
Can anybody answer that? Senator Francis?
I would just note that KSA 75-1120 is the statute that requires the audit. The audit that I have seen from GMDs was prepared by an outside firm.
Okay, thank you. Senator Strzok.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And who do they report to with that? Their local electors, or who?
The audit is reported to the board so that the board that's overseeing them knows that they're doing their fiduciary responsibility. So, the board is making the expenditures. The audit just clarifies to the board that those expenditures have all been made for the purposes that they were intended. Just like any board would audit their, have an audit of their finances. I think there's another amendment that would be asking to have that audit put on the website so it would be more available, but that's not part of this amendment.
Senator Strzok.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So they're currently audited, but they are not required to report that to Division of Water Resources or the Department of Agriculture or the Chief Engineer, as this bill would require them to, correct?
This bill is asking that the legislature receive that audit. So this is not saying that the chief engineer receives the audit. The legislature is the group that allowed these groundwater districts to be taxing districts. I think it's very appropriate that we do have some oversight because it's the state authority that has allowed those taxes to be collected. This would be a way to review that.
Okay. Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm full of questions today, I guess. What is high usage groundwater, high rates of decline? That's pretty arbitrary.
Senator Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was trying to take this in chunks. So the first chunk was just this question about the reports. I'd be happy to start in if we don't have any more questions about that. I'd be happy to talk about the chunk that starts on page 2. Okay. And I
Go to the second chunk.
thank you. This has actually been done in the Senate fairly quickly. I know that the House Water Committee had a long time to review this. So on the second page, The first change of dates is just eliminating the responsibility of the chief, or the chief engineer to be able to make the decision of extending that date. So it was just saying if they could get 6 months, they're just getting 6 months. So that's the December 31st. We changed, we added within each such board's district so that each district didn't have to identify the areas of concerns in every district. But down to your question, when we talk about the estimated usable lifetime of groundwater is 50 years or less, I'm saying in an area of high usage and high rates. I asked the Kansas Geological Survey presenter what they might consider a high rate of decline. I think that that's something that we still need to address. My concern, and the reason I'm adding it, is because we could have an area such as Little Jerusalem State Park, where there is, and I don't know what the estimated groundwater there is, but I do know that there's probably not going to be a lot of demand for irrigation in that area. And so I don't want to have an area of concern be a place where there's no intention to use water, because all of a sudden then we're just adding to the responsibility. So I'm trying to combine in some way the estimated usable lifetime and that there is high usage and high rates of decline. This is what we, I don't know, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Senator Dole, I'm going to follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A high rate of decline in groundwater table this year would be much more than would be a year that we have rain. In Garden City, we had 5 inches of rain, I think, for the year. So groundwater decline will be at a much greater rate than it would be like 2 years ago. So are we doing this year by year? Are we doing this by an average, or how are we doing this?
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In thinking about that, when we talked about priority areas of concern may also include areas where there's been a high usage and high decline. We did talk about that being over the previous 5 years, and perhaps it would make sense to add that over the previous 5 years in this first section as well. We're taking this in 5-year chunks. We're looking at it in 5 years. So they would have, if they're doing their review every 5 years, they would have that average for the 5 years of use and decline. So I think that would be a very helpful addition to this. And I see Tamara taking notes.
Any other comments on this section? Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wholeheartedly agree with Senator Dahl's comments about what is considered high usage, what's considered high rates of decline. And let me go back to some of my comments from the other day. This bill was introduced by a representative from Overland Park. And Overland Park is not included. All of Johnson County, pretty much over half the state, is not included in these groundwater management districts. We only have 5 Kansas state senators from Reno County West, which encompasses the majority of the groundwater management districts. I think it would be irresponsible to think that future legislators, let alone this legislative body, fully understands the unique situation in Western Kansas. It's irresponsible to think that they understand weather patterns, agriculture, crop yields. There's a lot involved. And what I do like about the GMDs is that each one of these individual boards can operate in their local district, and they can make policy to help regulate and come up with a plan themselves. What I don't like is taking these groundwater management districts, forcing them to provide certain information that may not apply to their situation, and giving even more power to this legislative body and every future one about how they use their water, if they're using too much. I mean, Finney County, Kansas doesn't tell Johnson County, Kansas when they can and can't water their lawns. It would be ridiculous to think that the majority of our legislature, which does come from Johnson County, should be telling Finney County how to irrigate their crops. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to comment on it. The water is obviously for the whole state, and what we're asking is people to report. We're not telling people what to do. The groundwater management, they're still under local control. We're not taking a step here of telling how much irrigators can use or not. And what we are asking, though, and everybody is concerned across the whole state, is, we need water. And it's a statewide. So if the person is from Johnson County or Wichita or Finney County or whatever, this is a concern for all of us. So I understand what you're saying. I am concerned that issue, but I don't see where this bill is causing that problem that you're speaking to. Senator Doe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect, what are they going to do with these reports? They're going to stack them somewhere. They're going to do something with these reports. And those reports are going to have a direct impact on Finney County, Barton County, and all these other things. Not anything east, but everything west. It's going to have an impact. They're not going to do these reports and put them on the wall.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the example that we've seen from the Limas, especially the Sheridan 6 Lima, was evidence that if you have this information, if you can focus on some areas of concern, then you can really help the situation. And we heard two things. We heard that the usage had gone down. We heard that the production had gone up.
Senator Doe.
Thank you. The production don't go up. The profit goes up because they have less input, but the bushels don't go up. Secondly, on these Limas, I don't know. So maybe Ken Titus could tell us or something. On these Limas, does that account, that 5-year account that we have, that rolling account on how many inches that you can use, does that apply to Limas? So if, the Limas says we can use 18 inches and I don't need but 14, do I get 22 on the following year within a Lima?
Can anybody help with that answer? Representative Titus, welcome to the committee.
Could you restate the question just to make sure I caught all of it?
I was wondering, within a Lima, with the 2 Limas that we have in 1 and 4, and we have these roving accounts that if you don't use so many inches this year, you could save that and use that next year. In a Lima, does that roll over like it does on a regular deal?
So it depends. All the Limas that have been established so far are for 5-year periods, and it's up to the next Lima whether or not they accept carryover. So they track that water, and if there's leftover, in some cases, GMDs have allowed a set amount of carryover, and in some cases, they've not allowed carryover.
Follow up, please.
Sure, go ahead.
So we have 2 of these Limas, correct?
We have 3 Limas now.
Okay, but 2 of them are in Wichita County or within in
Sheridan
4,
6, GMD 4, Wichita County.
which is in GMD 4, right?
Which is in 1. Wichita County is GMD 1.
Okay, so specifically then, how many of these will allow carryover. I would think that would be critical when you're, especially when you're cutting down your inches, and then all of a sudden you have a year like we're having this year.
The way they've been written is that carryover should be considered by the next group. So they usually get together a panel that does a review of the data, and then they say, we'll consider your savings for a carryover, but it's ultimately up to the GMD when they write the new Lima plan whether to put that in or not. It is certainly allowed, though.
It's, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
It's completely local controlled in,
Yes.
completely. That's all I need, thanks.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I might be called for page pictures at any point, so I'm wondering if I could just finish on the third chunk, and
Yes, go right ahead.
then committee could talk about the rest of this. Those were changes to determining the areas of concern. And the third part of this, on page 3, it talks about every 5 years, but it doesn't say when that starts. So it seems like we should have a date. So this new language in the second box, it just says every 5 years as provided herein, talks about or separates the districts. If a district includes one or more of these LIMAs or enhanced management areas, the 5-year review for the schedule is established by agreement between the chief engineer and the board of the district, because then if this LIMA is for 5 years, they can coordinate it. So when I asked the director from Shannon from Ground Management District 4, she said absolutely this would help her. So instead of the legislature picking the 5 years, if you have a groundwater district that has a LIMA that has these 5-year terms, you can make that term fit your review. So you're sort of doing it in one chunk. And then the other districts start this review 5 years after the action plan was first reviewed. So,
Senator Dahl.
I don't think, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you know this, but sometimes I have trouble following rules and things. But do we have like line item veto on this sort of thing? Because there's some of this that I really like, but you know, like on page 3, lines 35 through 39, I think that needs to stay.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
We certainly, in adopting amendment, can choose what parts to adopt and what parts not to adopt. The concern that I have with this 35 to 36, if you do read it, it says, all areas within a local enhanced management area established shall be considered to be in compliance with the requirements of this section. Okay, you go back to the section, the LIMAs are not required to do anything. It is the board of the district that's required. So we're saying some areas shall be considered to be in compliance, but it doesn't matter because we're not asking the local management areas. They're not the ones, and maybe the reviser can help me with this, but my concern is the requirements are on the board of each of the groundwater districts. So whether you're in compliance or not, there's nothing that lets you do or lets you not do. And Tamara, could you help me with that?
So this language was added by the House committee. So I would welcome anyone who was there at the House committee to speak. But my understanding of this is that if there is a LIMA area within a GMD, the GMD wouldn't necessarily have to come up with action plans for that specific area for the first 5 years.
I think that that's the intent, but I'm not sure that that's the language because it talks about LIMAs being in compliance, not the board being in
Representative
compliance.
Titus, would you like to weigh in on this again? Thank you for coming to the committee.
is an opportunity, thank you, Mr. Chairman, to actually speak of intent since I was there instead of guessing as a lawyer in my office later what we were thinking. So the language that was added in subsection D on page 3, so it's struck with this amendment about line 35. Honestly, the way it's rewritten here, it accomplishes the same thing with just a little more specificity. But the idea is, my biggest concern with these amendments is the strike of any new areas. That was pretty intentional because as conditions change, new areas could drop below the threshold for use. So in that 5-year plan, part of the review process was to keep reviewing your data because you may have new areas created. But the idea is if you're in Alima, you've already identified an area, you're taking action, and that doesn't need to be, you don't need to spend resources reevaluating that until you do your second review. That was the intent of that.
Senator Dahl.
Representative Tice, help me out on this. Does a GMD have control over the Lima within their GMD?
They are the ones that set all the criteria.
Who does?
The GMD board sets all of the criteria and the cuts. The chief engineer can reject a plan if he doesn't like it, but he cannot modify what comes forward at hearing without the GMD board's approval.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am so pleased that you came and made that comment because again, we were trying to work on this very quickly. I got the information to our revisor, I think the day before yesterday, but I didn't get this back until yesterday afternoon. She may check, but I think I asked for this to include, to identify current areas. Because what I was trying to do in striking the language of new areas was to say that you could have, especially if it's the contamination, if that's cleaned up, I don't want that to have to remain an area of concern. So, Tamara, could you check? We talked about having that current areas, priority areas. Is that the case?
Yes, and if you look at the first box, it does say in the district at large to identify the current priority areas of concern.
Thank you. So that language, so each 5 years, you have to say what are the current areas. So that would include any areas that still exist and new ones, and thank you for that.
I read that to only mean the areas you initially identify, as in we've currently designated these areas, and we wouldn't be looking to designate new areas.
I meant it to be current areas, and perhaps we could look at that language because that's important.
While I'm up here, assuming I don't get to come up again, if the committee would indulge me, the one thing talking to my colleagues that does cause us some heartburn, that I agree with Senator Dahl's sentiments that parts of this are helpful and good, but on page 2, the changing the criteria for including the high usage of groundwater and high rates of decline, I believe that opens up. Essentially, this moves us to now the entire discussion of these plans will be, well, what constitutes high usage and what constitutes high decline? We had some language, I think, that we provided to Senator Francisco that allowed KGS to develop alternative metrics that were similar to the 50-year decline. And I understand that you didn't necessarily like that language, but this language to us is problematic for implementation.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you. My concern with that language was it just said, and I should have it, but just alternative metrics, and those aren't defined either. Those are also open to discussion. And so I think this is really important to have this bill passed. And I do know that there's going to be some discussion between the House and the Senate if these changes are made. I'm not, I'm trying to make it better, and I'm not saying that these things all have to be adopted. I'd like that back and forth between the House, because I think what I heard from the Kansas Geological Survey is they were uncomfortable with just the wording in A. And I don't think we've come up with the wording yet. I think adding this high usage and high rates of decline makes that absolutely open to and conferenceable, and I'd love to have that discussion. I'm not sure we can come up with wording for that today.
Well, my concern, if we're making too many changes, this passed to the House with like 119 votes. And if you're making more changes with everybody buying into it, we can have a lot more problems. And we got some discussion in a couple of areas here, where a couple senators, especially the area with the high usage part. Boy, time is flying this morning too. But we can, of my understanding, we could divide the question on this. Isn't that right, Tamara? And we could vote on Senator Dahl. Would you be comfortable in making a motion to strike that, and we can vote on it, and what your concern is?
To be quite frank, I'm not comfortable with anything right now until I get a chance to study this and talk to some of the lobbyists and things like that to see where I'm just not comfortable with any of this right now.
All right, thank you. Senator Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize for the timing of this. Again, you know, I did make the request for the amendment. I tried to provide as much information as I could, but this was a very tight schedule in terms of having a hearing and making those changes. So I'm very pleased that we could share that with the committee today. We might want to defer this until Monday and do it at that point. But I think this is very helpful to hear this discussion, to have an audience, and they can all make comments to each of us. Thank you.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Francisco, for your passion on this topic. And I can tell you and assure you that our groundwater management district boards are just as passionate as you are, if not more so. And so are our irrigators in western Kansas. They are the original conservationists. So with that said, I would like to table this indefinitely. And I move to table this.
Is that a debatable? We just vote on it when she tables it? Oh, do we have a second? Dies for lack of a second. Okay, we're on with amendment. Well, I move that we wait till Monday. We can look at this and see what changes we can make or not. But I can't make that motion.
Can we make a motion to adjourn and then meet again and publish in the calendar that we're planning to do this? And I really appreciate that, because I think some of the comments that I've gotten, and I will promise not to have nearly as an extensive amendment, but I would like to see if I can have some information about declining rates of groundwater, or making sure that we understand, change that thing of current, and I think we can make this better. So can you move that the committee adjourn?
I move that we adjourn to Monday. Thank you.